They laughed when the red wine hit his chest, thought he was a nobody. But as Keanu Reeves stood humiliated beneath $1 million chandelier, a name echoed through the ballroom that changed everything. Richard Gere had just walked in. What happened next shattered reputations, exposed a global secret, and left the world speechless. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. He didn't belong here, at least not in the way they thought he should. Keanu stood near the edge of the ballroom beneath a chandelier so large it looked like it had been stolen from a palace. He wore a navy cotton jacket with lint on the collar, faded jeans, and a black shirt that had seen better days. His boots, scuffed at the toes and creased around the edges, rested awkwardly on polished marble that reflected the soft golden light above him. Around him swirled a sea of diamonds, champagne, and couture. The Devonshire Grand's annual gala was known for excess, elegance, and exclusivity. Everyone here had arrived in limousines or town cars. Everyone had names etched into donation plaques. Everyone knew how to glide across the room like they were born on marble. But Keanu didn't glide. He walked quietly, slowly, with purpose. The server hadn't meant to do it. He'd been young, barely 20, clearly nervous, tray trembling in his hands as he weaved through gowns and tuxedos. The glass of red wine had wobbled for several seconds before it finally tipped. A splash of deep crimson hit Keanu's chest, just left of center, soaking into the fabric and running down in uneven streams. It spread like a wound. The young server gasped. His hands shook. He stepped back quickly. I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't see you there. Keanu looked at him, calm, expression unreadable. It's all right, he said softly. Accidents happen. But the crowd around them didn't let it go so easily. From somewhere to the left, a sharp voice sliced through the awkward silence. Who let the janitor onto the floor? Laughter bubbled up. Not loud, not explosive, but cruel in its restraint. Someone muttered near the champagne tower, must have taken a wrong turn with the mop bucket. Keanu didn't respond. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded white napkin, dabbing gently at the stain. The chandelier above him glittered like a crown no one had invited him to wear. Eyes followed him, not because they recognized him, but because they didn't end. Because in a room full of names, he was an unannounced question mark. Because nothing about him said he belonged. A few guests turned away in mild disgust. Others watched with amused curiosity. It wasn't the first time someone at one of these galas had been outed as not one of them. But it was the first time someone stood so still, so unbothered. He didn't cower. He didn't bark back. He didn't explain. He just stood there, red wine blooming on his shirt, staring quietly into the golden space around him like it wasn't his dignity on trial but theirs. And then the spotlight hit. A harsh white beam from above, brighter than the chandelier, brighter than anything else in the room, locked directly onto Keanu Reeves. The room froze. In the span of 3 heartbeats, murmurs died, champagne flutes stopped mid-air, and half the ballroom turned toward the man now standing in the spotlight. The red wine on his shirt looked like a target, or maybe a warning. Someone in the back whispered, "Why is he being highlighted?" Another voice chimed in, confused. Is he a performance artist? No one moved. No one spoke above a murmur, except for the voice that came next, smooth, amplified, dripping with manufactured charm. From the second-floor balcony, Vivienne Delacourt leaned over the banister, holding a mic, headset to her lips. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "please join me in welcoming one of our surprise donors this evening, the ever-generous Mr. Ken Reeves." There was a pause, a ripple of confusion. "Ken Reeves?" someone said aloud. "Never heard of him," another guest replied. Several heads turned toward each other in puzzled glances. A polite smattering of applause began, the kind used to cover uncertainty, just enough to keep up appearances, just enough to hide the discomfort of not knowing who the man in the spotlight actually was. Keanu didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't step forward. He just stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes fixed not on the crowd but on Vivienne. Vivienne, of course, knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a fumbled introduction. It was an execution. A silent, calculated assassination of image and pride. She had called him Ken, not Keanu, not Mr. Reeves. Ken. A deliberate misnaming. A signal to the crowd that he wasn't someone to be taken seriously. That he wasn't someone worth knowing. And the name stuck. Ken? Someone said near the front. Ken who? Others chuckled nervously. A few raised their phones. One woman in a sequin dress began filming. The server who had spilled the wine earlier stood frozen by the wall, pale and wide-eyed. He looked like he wanted to disappear. Keanu remained motionless under the harsh light. Then Vivienne's voice returned, silk-wrapped and venom-tipped. He's graciously funded a portion of tonight's catering, despite showing up a little underdressed. Another thin wave of laughter moved through the crowd. Keanu's shoulders lifted, just slightly. Not in protest, not in shame. He took a single breath and exhaled slowly. He was alone in the spotlight. A man with a stained shirt, surrounded by strangers in tailored suits and polished smiles. And they had no idea who he really was. Not yet, but upstairs, behind the glass wall of the control room, Vivienne's smirk faltered just for a second because she noticed something in his eyes. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't intimidated. He was waiting. The spotlight lingered longer than it should have, almost uncomfortably so. It wasn't just meant to highlight him. It was meant to trap him there, to pin him under judgment, under scrutiny, under the weight of expectation that he would either wilt or run. But Keanu didn't move. He tilted his head slightly, letting the light hit the red stain on his shirt. The silence in the room grew thicker. No one clapped now. No one laughed. They were watching, but no one could explain why. "Is this part of the show?" Someone whispered. "Maybe he's a comedian," said another, unsure. Keanu slowly stepped one pace back, into the shadow just beyond the spotlight's reach. The light strained to follow him, but didn't. It stayed where he had stood, as if waiting for someone else to take his place, but no one did. And then, he did something unexpected. He smiled. Not the wide grin of someone enjoying attention. It was smaller than that, controlled, quiet. A smile that didn't rise to meet their eyes, because it wasn't for them. It was the kind of smile you give when the mask someone tried to put on you doesn't fit, when you realize they've mistaken your silence for weakness and your presence for an accident. Vivienne, still watching from the balcony, narrowed her eyes. That smile unsettled her more than anything. She hadn't expected confidence. She hadn't expected calm. She had expected a man to break. Instead, he looked amused. He began to walk, not toward the stage, but toward the far corner of the room where no one was watching, away from the spotlight, away from the performance. A guest near the dessert table muttered, "Guess he didn't like the attention." Another added, "He's probably embarrassed." But Keanu wasn't retreating. He was repositioning. Behind him, Vivienne turned away from the railing and whispered into her headset, "Hold the spotlight on the empty floor. Let the audience stay confused. Keep him in the background. We're done with him." Her assistant's voice crackled through the earpiece, hesitant. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Vivienne snapped. He had his moment. Now let it die. Back on the ballroom floor, Keanu stopped beside a marble column, half in shadow. He glanced around the room once more, eyes scanning with subtle precision exits, security locations, art placement, surveillance angles. He wasn't humiliated. He was gathering. They had mistaken him for a man beneath them. They thought they'd labeled him, dismissed him, erased him. But this wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. Because in that red wine stain, in the humiliation they thought they'd served him, they hadn't seen what he had really brought with him. He wasn't here to be noticed. He was here to watch them. And the spotlight had just made everyone else too blind to see it. 45 minutes earlier, the Devonshire Grand gleamed like a palace carved out of wealth. The entire block had been cordoned off for the gala. Red velvet ropes stretched across both sidewalks. Valets opened the doors of foreign cars that shimmered under the city's soft winter light. Engines purred and heels clicked, mingling with the gentle music rising from inside the hotel's domed atrium. This wasn't just a party, it was a declaration of power. The guest list included senators, hedge fund tycoons, heirs to old empires, and celebrities so curated they looked like they'd been printed rather than born. Photographers snapped pictures as couples posed against branded backdrops. Hosts sipped champagne from crystal flutes. Diamond bracelets caught the light like camera flashes. Everyone looked like they belonged. Everyone except the man across the street. Keanu stood at the corner, still as a statue, hands in his jacket pockets. His navy coat had a missing button. His jeans were clean but frayed at the hem. A plain baseball cap covered most of his hair, and his boots had salt stains from the sidewalk. There was no limousine behind him, no handler by his side. Just a long breath as he stepped off the curb and crossed into their world. The security guard at the outer rope barely glanced at him, assumed he was working. Keanu offered no objection. He walked up the marble steps and through the towering glass doors of the Devonshire Grand, where everything smelled like citrus and old money. And that was when she spotted him. Vivienne Delacourt had been stationed in the main lobby for less than 10 minutes. A former fashion editor turned curator of elite experiences, she had an instinct for spotting what didn't belong. She saw him before he even reached the second step. The worn boots, the coat with lint on the collar, the cap, the silence. She crossed the room swiftly, the hem of her satin dress brushing against polished tile. "Excuse me," she said, stepping directly in front of him. Keanu stopped. Vivienne smiled with the tightness of someone being watched. Her voice lowered to something polite, but condescending. "The kitchen entrance is in the back," she said, with a quick glance at the paper he was holding. Keanu didn't speak. He reached into the inner lining of his coat and pulled out a silver-edged envelope. Real vellum, embossed with raised gold ink, the kind of invitation that hadn't been issued in years. Vivienne took it between two fingers, as if it might have smudged her manicure. She turned it over, reading the lettering slowly. "Who even sends these anymore?" she muttered, then louder, for anyone nearby to hear. "I told the team to stop mailing physical invitations." She flipped it open, glanced at the details, then looked up at him. Her eyes scanned his face, not with recognition, but suspicion. She looked past him toward the doors as if waiting for someone else. Someone important, but it was just him. And the wind outside. Vivienne flipped the invitation shut with a flick of her fingers. She didn't hand it back immediately. She held it at her side, like it was a prop. Her eyes dropped again to his boots, then climbed slowly jeans, plain black t-shirt, unbranded coat, ball cap. "You are," she began, letting the sentence dangle. Keanu didn't answer. He didn't look offended. He simply met her gaze with a calm stillness that unsettled her more than defiance would have. Vivienne blinked first. "I'll have to confirm this with the registry," she said quickly. "Just a formality." She turned on her heel and walked toward the check-in table, her stilettos clicking like accusations on marble. Keanu didn't follow. He remained where he was, still as ever, eyes quietly scanning the room. The chandelier above him glistened like an artificial sun. Beyond the reception, the grand ballroom buzzed with pre-auction activity. Waiters in white gloves drifted like chess pieces. Guests air-kissed over $1,000 wine glasses. Security men whispered into sleeves. The Devonshire Grand was an ecosystem built on power, status, and flawless presentation. And now, it had a crack. Vivienne returned after several minutes, holding the same envelope, now folded more carelessly than before. "It checks out," she said reluctantly. "You're on the list." She didn't sound pleased. Keanu reached for the envelope, but she didn't give it back. "Although next time," she added, lowering her voice, "you might consider dressing more appropriately. Some of our guests are quite sensitive." Keanu raised one eyebrow, but said nothing. Vivienne moved slightly to the side, just enough to technically allow him to pass, but not enough to make it feel like a welcome. "Please don't touch the art," she added with a thin smile. Keanu stepped forward. No nod, no thank you. just a quiet crossing of an invisible line. He walked past her and entered the hallway that led to the ballroom. The lighting grew warmer, the music clearer, the voices sharper. Behind him, Vivienne watched him go. Her fingers tapped against the side of her clutch, face unreadable. She didn't recognize him. Not yet, but something about the way he carried himself, so quietly certain, so unaffected by her dismissal, bothered her. It was like he knew something she didn't. Like he was already 10 steps ahead, and the rest of them were dancing in a room they thought they owned. She turned to one of the assistants nearby. "Track his movement," she said under her breath. The assistant blinked. "Ma'am? I want to know who he talks to. Who talks to him? Where he goes?" Discreetly. "Yes, ma'am." Vivienne turned back to the check-in table and forced a practiced smile. She'd allowed him in, but she hadn't accepted him. Not really. And by the time she realized the cost of that choice, it would be too late. Keanu passed through the arched corridor leading to the main ballroom. The space opened up like a cathedral, walls trimmed with golden paneling, floors so polished they reflected every chandelier's shimmer like liquid light. A string quartet played in the corner beneath an oil painting worth more than most people's homes. Laughter sparkled, silver clinked. Money talked, in the language of polished shoes, and eye contact that lasted just long enough to measure value. He kept walking. No one greeted him. No one asked his name. But they noticed, even if they pretended not to. A pair of women near the staircase gave him a glance that started at his cap and ended at his boots. One whispered something. The other giggled. A man holding a flute of champagne muttered under his breath, "Dress codes really don't mean anything anymore." Keanu didn't flinch. He walked slowly, observing. Every painting, every camera tucked into the ceiling corners, every overly lit sculpture. He wasn't just seeing the art, he was looking through it. At the far end of the ballroom stood a massive canvas, draped in velvet, a centerpiece yet to be unveiled. Keanu paused for just a moment, eyes narrowing slightly. He knew what they claimed it was, and he knew what it really wasn't. He moved again, settling near a side wall, just beyond the main flow of traffic. Servers passed with trays of hors d'oeuvres and caviar bites. A man in a velvet jacket brushed past him and scoffed. "They'll let anyone in these days, won't they?" Keanu said nothing. He leaned against a marble column and let the room blur into motion. His presence, unannounced and unexplained, served as a quiet disruption. People didn't like not knowing, and worse, they didn't like seeing someone who didn't care to be known. Vivienne had returned to her perch on the second-floor balcony. She stood with a crystal coupe in one hand, her other resting on the rail, gaze flitting across the room. She spotted him again, still there, still quiet, still calm. Her smirk faded slightly. No networking, no selfies, no small talk, just stillness. It unsettled her more than shouting would have. She turned to a man beside her, a silver-haired investor with too much cologne and not enough tact. "Do you know who that is?" she asked. He squinted. "Never seen him before. Art blogger?" Vivienne shook her head. "Doesn't speak like one." "Well," the man shrugged, "either he's rich enough not to care, or stupid enough not to know where he island." She laughed softly, but her fingers tightened around her glass. In a room full of curated perfection, Keanu Reeves had become the flaw. And in places like this, flaws weren't tolerated. They were isolated, silenced, removed. What Vivienne didn't realize yet was that this particular flaw had been invited for a reason, not by mistake, not by accident, but by design, and he had just stepped through the door they never should have opened. The ballroom exhaled as Keanu stepped fully into it. His entrance made no announcement. No one introduced him. No spotlight guided his path. But his presence cracked something invisible, an unspoken expectation about who should be there and who shouldn't. He didn't walk fast. He didn't linger. He moved like someone with no need to impress. But the room noticed him. Eyes lifted. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Some glances were fleeting, quickly followed by polite smiles or pointed laughter. Others lasted longer, brows furrowed as minds raced to categorize him. He didn't wear a name tag, didn't offer handshakes. And in a room full of social performance, a man without a script stood out more than the chandelier. A man near the silent auction table muttered under his breath, "Security must be asleep." His companion didn't bother whispering. "Is this a prank?" Keanu continued walking, hands in his jacket pockets. The air smelled like citrus, champagne, and old wood polish. There were too many mirrors, too much shine, too much pretending. He moved past an older couple, who stepped aside a little too quickly. The woman clutched her pearls reflexively. The man eyed Keanu's boots like they were tracking in disease. And still, Keanu didn't flinch. He scanned everything. Not with the hunger of someone trying to belong, but with the precision of someone who already knew what mattered. The paintings were staged with calculated drama, dramatic lighting, dramatic spacing, dramatic valuations. One canvas, titled "Still Echoes," had a brass plaque beneath it, with a price tag north of $300,000. He paused. The signature was familiar, too familiar. He moved on. At the center of the ballroom, under the highest arch of the dome ceiling, stood the evening's crown jewel, a painting half shrouded in translucent silk. The spotlight above it was angled just so, creating a golden aura that made it glow from a distance. A cluster of guests had gathered around it, murmuring to each other, like parishioners near a relic. The plaque below read, "Dusk over Fire, Claude Desmarais, 1928. Keanu stopped 10 feet away. He didn't need to get closer. He knew the piece, or rather, he knew the original. He had seen it 2 years ago in a stone gallery in Montreux. The original had soft cracking in the oil, an uneven top frame, and 3 precise brushstrokes that had always reminded him of a falcon's wing. A masterwork full of pain and movement and light. This one was wrong. The canvas looked too fresh. The balance was off. The blending near the top right corner had been corrected too recently, too cleanly. Even the hue of the signature was sharper than it should have been. It wasn't just a reproduction, it was a lie, and someone was trying to pass it off as a miracle. Keanu's eyes narrowed, but his face remained blank. He took 2 slow steps back and let the crowd continue to fawn over it. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Not yet. Behind him, the conversations resumed. But they weren't the same. People talked a little louder, as if trying to drown out something they couldn't quite name. A few tilted their glasses in his direction without looking. Others leaned toward each other with questions that never formed into sentences. Is he? No, I don't think so. Should someone? No, don't make a scene. Keanu moved along the outer edge of the ballroom, never stepping too close to the center, never getting in anyone's way. But he watched everything. A pair of servers walked by, trays balanced perfectly, and he clocked the rhythm of their circuit. Every 15 minutes they reset from the kitchen, sweeping the same pattern in reverse. That told him where the service entrance was and where they avoided stopping. The floor plan was telling its own story. He glanced toward the balcony above. A frosted glass wall concealed the private suite, where the gala directors oversaw the event. One panel wasn't frosted fully by design. A silhouette moved behind it. Tall, angular. Someone was watching. Keanu lowered his gaze. Near the eastern alcove, a sculpture rested on a pedestal. Abstract, minimalist, falsely ancient. He recognized it too. The original had been lost in a museum fire a decade ago. But here it stood, recast, relabeled, reinvented, and no one seemed to care. He stopped near a display of smaller canvases, lesser-known artists, with inflated labels. A man beside him spoke into his phone, bragging about getting in early on a piece before the bubble pops. The canvas he pointed to was crooked in its frame. The illusion here wasn't just about art. It was about belief. If you believed hard enough, the price became real. The prestige, the value, the lie, it all required agreement. Keanu didn't agree. He took a sip from a glass of sparkling water and continued moving along the fringe. People kept avoiding his eyes. Even Vivienne. She had returned to the floor now, making small talk with donors near the stage. Her laugh was too sharp, her posture too alert, but she wouldn't look at him. He was an anomaly, and anomalies made people nervous. A woman walked by in a green silk gown and muttered just loud enough, "Wrong room, wrong night, wrong decade." Someone near the silent auction said, "If he touches that sculpture, they're gonna call security." But no one called, because despite the discomfort, despite the whispers, no one wanted to be the one who made the first move. What if he was someone important? What if they were wrong? And Keanu? He didn't care either way. He wasn't here for them. He was here for what was hiding beneath them. The question wasn't who had invited him. The question was why he had said yes. Keanu circled back toward the heart of the ballroom and paused again near the centerpiece, painting dusk over fire. This time, he stood slightly behind a row of velvet chairs set up for overquas. The later auction. His posture was relaxed, but his attention was laser sharp. Two men in tailored suits stood nearby, sipping aged whiskey and marveling over the so-called masterpiece. "One of a kind," said the taller one, his voice full of the confidence that comes from wealth. "The last of Desmarais' late-period work. It'll break 3 million, easy." Keanu's gaze flicked to a detail in the lower corner of the canvas. The signature was offset by a millimeter, barely noticeable to anyone who hadn't studied Desmarais' original catalog. But Keanu had. He knew this was no late-period masterpiece. It was a cover. He took another step back and leaned casually against one of the pillars lining the wall. From there, he could see nearly the entire room. The security team wore matching lapel pins and circled in predictable loops. The cameras were motion-responsive, mounted inside the chandeliers, designed to swivel slowly, never sharply. The coverage left blind spots, 3 of them to be exact. He noted them all. The gala wasn't just a display of wealth. It was a controlled performance. Every movement, every guest, every piece of art was orchestrated to maintain the illusion that this place was untouchable. But illusions cracked when you knew where to press. Keanu's fingers drifted to the inside pocket of his coat. The tiny recorder embedded there had been running since the moment he stepped through the doors. Every whisper, every name, every misstep, recorded and tagged. He didn't know everyone involved yet, but he would. He watched as Vivienne made her way back toward the stage. Her voice, from across the room, was loud enough to carry, but soft enough to sound natural. She greeted a man named Arda Demir, tall, Turkish, draped in gray silk and arrogance. They shook hands. She handed him a USB drive. Keanu's breath slowed. He had seen Demir before, once in Monaco, once in Prague, and both times, something went missing after he left. This gala wasn't just for charity. It was a laundering front, wrapped in brushed gold and auction paddles. Keanu raised his glass, as if admiring the centerpiece again. But he wasn't looking at the art. He was looking at the fraud, the forgery that had become the centerpiece of an empire. And everyone applauding it? They weren't just complicit. They were part of the show. He took one last glance around the room. Dozens of people, laughing, clinking glasses, praising things they didn't understand. He didn't need to announce what he saw. Not yet. The room still thought it was whole. But something had entered it. A quiet presence, a crack. And sooner or later, everything around that crack would start to shift. Keanu stood near the marble column with a half-empty glass of water in one hand, his back partially turned toward the room. The noise had returned to its steady hum forks on glass. Laughter from throats too used to hiding discomfort, champagne flowing like currency. The crowd had absorbed him again, convinced they'd won by ignoring him. But he had already slipped beneath their notice, exactly where he wanted to be. His eyes traveled upward toward the balcony that overlooked the ballroom. The frosted glass panels shimmered under the chandelier light. Most of it was opaque, but a narrow strip along the top left corner had been left translucent, either intentionally or through neglect. That gap was enough. Through it, Keanu could see 2 figures. One of them he recognized instantly, Vivienne Delacourt. She stood near the glass, posture perfect, head tilted in elegant conversation with a man whose face hadn't changed much since the last time Keanu had seen it. Arda Demir, tall, regal. Gray at the temples, Turkish billionaire with holdings spread across Europe, Asia, and a network of shell companies that never seemed to pay taxes in any country. His reputation in public was as a patron of the arts, a funder of restoration projects, and a collector of rare antiquities. But Keanu knew better. He had seen Demir at a gallery in Istanbul 2 years earlier, the night before the Turkish authorities raided it and uncovered over 40 forged artifacts and 5 pieces stolen from the Louvre's off-site inventory. The gallery owner disappeared. The building burned to the ground a week later. And Demir? He gave a televised donation to earthquake relief and walked away untouched. Now here he was again, smiling at Vivienne, reaching into his inner jacket pocket, pulling out something small, a thin metal case. Vivienne responded with a subtle nod. She leaned closer to him, whispered something, and extended her hand. He gave it to her. A flash drive, slim, matte black, possibly encrypted. She tucked it into the side of her clutch without breaking her expression. The exchange was quick, controlled, too practiced to be innocent. Keanu's hand drifted into the inside of his coat. He felt for the tiny scanner clipped into his inner lining, right beneath the label. A custom tool smaller than a thumb drive, but capable of picking up wireless signals and identifying data transfer frequencies. He slipped it from the lining, concealed in his palm, and clicked the side twice. No light, no beep, just a quiet hum, detectable only by touch. He held it low, sweeping casually along the inside hem of his jacket as he shifted positions. One pass toward the sculpture pedestal, another toward the north wall, then a slow turn back toward the auction area. The scanner pulsed once, then again. Encrypted transmissions were active within the ballroom. Narrow frequency bands, short bursts. Someone was relaying data, possibly the contents of that drive, off-site in real time. And it wasn't just coming from upstairs. It was embedded here, on the floor. Keanu turned slightly to his right, allowing the crowd to shift around him without suspicion. The device in his hand vibrated again, faint and brief. It picked up a localized transmission point within 30 feet of where he stood. The signal was masked, but not hidden well enough. Someone in the ballroom was transmitting encrypted data, likely to a server, possibly offshore. The gala wasn't just a social event, it was a transfer hub. Keanu's eyes followed the pattern of the servers. One tray drifted by a little slower than the others. Not enough to be suspicious to an untrained eye, but enough to catch his attention. He stepped slightly closer as the young man passed. At first glance, the server looked ordinary. Uniform crisp, collar straight. But tucked just beneath the white linen napkin folded across his left forearm was a small bulge. Not food, not tools, a device. Keanu brushed past the server gently, timing it with the motion of guests crossing in front of them. His scanner buzzed sharply as he passed. That was it. The transmission was being relayed from multiple carriers moving through the ballroom, like couriers in plain sight. The signal didn't originate from one source, it hopped between them. He stepped back toward the column and slid the device into his inner coat pocket. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't opportunistic fraud. It was coordinated. He looked up again toward the balcony. Vivienne was gone. Arda Demir remained, speaking to another man Keanu didn't recognize. Broader shoulders, square jaw, probably one of the enforcers, not a planner. The dance of deception continued above them, but the floor below was just as complicit. Keanu reached for a second device in his pocket, smaller, shaped like a hotel keycard. He palmed it discreetly and moved toward the air intake vent near the hallway that led to the rear gallery. It was quieter there, fewer people, just the hum of jazz from the main room and the occasional burst of laughter that carried too far. He knelt briefly, pretending to retie his bootlace. In that motion, he slid the card-sized reader into the vent opening. It clicked into place magnetically. A green pulse blinked once, confirming a signal lock. He stood and adjusted his jacket. Back in Santa Fe, a server room inside a secure facility lit up. A green dot blinked on screen. Phase 1 was complete. Keanu had triangulated the transmission path. But he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. He walked slowly back into the ballroom, blending with the crowd once more. The wine stain still faintly marked his shirt, a detail no one had bothered to notice earlier. They thought he was a mistake. They thought he didn't belong. But while they admired brushstrokes and fought for paddle numbers, Keanu was unraveling the thing that bound them all together. A lie. One stroke at a time. Keanu returned to the main ballroom just as the lights dimmed, slightly in preparation for the next round of arrivals. The orchestra shifted tempo, and a new wave of guests began filtering in through the east hallway. More influencers, more diplomats, more art investors. The room was swelling again, with noise and perfume and wealth. But to Keanu, it felt colder. He kept his head low, drifting toward the perimeter once more. His path took him past the dessert bar and into the corner alcove where less popular pieces were displayed. It was quieter here, less curated, a hiding place within a spotlight. From this angle, he had a clean line of sight to the second level once more. Arda Demir had reappeared in the glass viewing box, now alone. His arms were folded, his head tilted slightly as if examining something below. But Keanu could feel it. Demir wasn't looking at the art. He was scanning the crowd, searching, a predator checking for loose ends. And if Demir had noticed him, even briefly, then the clock had started ticking. Keanu turned toward one of the small canvases hung near the staircase, an abstract painting in gray and rust-red strokes, unremarkable, except for the brass plate attached to the frame, which read, "Donated anonymously in partnership with Arda Demir Foundation." He stepped closer and pulled out his micro lens, embedded in a ring on his index finger. He angled it quickly and captured the corner of the frame. There it was, an embedded RFID chip. Not standard for art cataloging, but very common in high-end smuggling operations, used to track movement through private customs lanes. This wasn't just about fake paintings. It was about how they moved the real ones out of museums, out of collections, out of countries. Keanu turned and began walking again, this time toward the large sculpture that had been brought in under security escort earlier that afternoon. It stood in the ballroom's far left corner, covered by a translucent veil and surrounded by velvet ropes. A few guests loitered nearby, pretending to discuss its bold geometry, though none of them had bothered to read the artist's name. He stopped a few paces back, just long enough for his scanner to buzz once more. Same frequency. Another data beacon hidden in the pedestal base. The entire gala had been staged not just as a charity event, but as a live handoff point. Physical art was the cover. Data laundering was the real show. Keanu exhaled. He now had 5 relay points, 1 major signal route, and the identity of the man coordinating it. But he needed confirmation, and that meant getting closer to Arda Demir. Closer than he'd been since Istanbul. The hunter had entered the ballroom tonight without a weapon, without backup, without a name on the list. But he wasn't empty-handed. He was building something. Evidence. Threads. Truth. And when it was finished, it would be loud enough to bring the entire room to silence. Keanu stood near the marble column again, where the music softened and the crowd thinned. The conversations had swelled with new energy. Paddles were being distributed. Waiters passed with even finer wines. The laughter was louder now, voices more animated. But beneath it all, the tension had shifted. The quiet hum of surveillance no longer felt passive. Something had changed upstairs. From the corner of his eye, he saw Vivienne descending the staircase once more. Her clutch clutched tighter, her smile practiced but strained. She scanned the room, looking for something or someone. Then her eyes landed on him. She paused. And just for a second, Keanu saw something he hadn't seen earlier. Recognition, number, but suspicion. She whispered something to a passing waiter, then continued gliding across the floor toward the east wing. Her heels clicked softer now, like she didn't want to draw attention, but the damage had already begun. Keanu shifted his weight, letting the moment pass. He took another step toward the dessert bar when it happened. A waiter, barely older than 20, carrying a tray of wine glasses, stumbled out of nowhere and turned too sharply. The tray tilted. A splash of red launched through the air and struck Keanu squarely in the chest. Again, the second spill of the night. Same place, same shirt, same stain. This one, even darker. The young server gasped. His eyes were wide, terrified. He opened his mouth to apologize, but the words didn't come. Keanu looked down at the spreading crimson. It soaked through the cotton slowly, creeping outward like blood. People noticed. Gasps, followed by muffled laughter, floated up from every direction. One woman near the staircase let out a theatrical gasp. Another man clinked his glass and said, "Guess we've got a clumsy staff tonight." The server stammered, I'm so sorry, sir, I didn't see." Vivian's voice cut clean through the noise. "Oh dear," she said sweetly, stepping forward, with perfect timing. "What is it with you tonight?" Her tone was gentle, but the blade was beneath it. She looked at Keanu with mock sympathy, head tilted, voice rising just enough for others to hear. "You know," she added with a soft laugh, "some of us dress properly for events like these. More laughter, a ripple, low and restrained, but unmistakable." Keanu didn't say a word. He didn't move. He simply looked at her. Not with defiance, not with embarrassment, just stillness. It was enough. Vivian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Then she turned, satisfied, and disappeared back into the crowd. The server backed away slowly, his tray trembling, until another waiter caught his elbow and pulled him into the back hallway. The stain on Keanu's shirt deepened, but he didn't wipe at it, didn't adjust his coat. He simply slipped his hand into the inside seam of his sleeve and pressed a button sewn into the cuff. No sound, no flash. But far across the city, a light blinked to life. The transmission had begun. Keanu stepped back into the shadow of the column, giving himself space to breathe. The chatter around him continued, but now it came with side glances, hidden grins, and whispers behind crystal flutes. No one dared approach him directly. They didn't need to. The humiliation had been designed to do its job from a distance. He could hear it in the tone of their voices. The way someone chuckled softly behind him and said, "Poor guy doesn't even realize he's the joke." Or the woman 2 steps away who whispered to her friend, "Do you think he snuck in? Maybe he's one of those obsessed fans. Should we alert someone?" He ignored it all. His focus was already elsewhere. The button in his sleeve had activated a passive relay, connecting his cufflink to the triangulated signal reader he'd planted earlier. Every encrypted burst from the embedded transmitters, whether in sculpture, pedestals, behind paintings, or hidden in security nodes, was now being routed to a secure server overseas. A live feed. Data was being recorded and decoded in real time. And the wine? That wasn't just a social punishment. It was a signal. He could smell it now, an oddly familiar fragrance layered beneath the acidic sting of the alcohol. Narrowly and wax, a signature scent. He remembered it vividly. It had been present in the Istanbul gallery before it burned, part of the packaging used to mask antique wood shipped in crates labeled as religious restoration supplies. The same blend had turned up again in Prague, in a different gallery that fronted as a charity but funneled stolen antiquities across 3 countries. And now it was here, in the wine, not the liquid itself. The napkin, the linen. The scent had clung to the fabric, embedded in the fibers. That meant whoever prepared the tray had touched packaging used in that same laundering network, the same circle, the same rot. He scanned the room again, more methodically this time. Vivian was back on the floor, smiling at donors, complimenting watches, nodding at politicians. Her mask was perfect, but now he knew what lay beneath it. She hadn't just orchestrated a moment of public shaming. She'd sent a warning. They saw him. They didn't know who he was yet, but they knew he wasn't random, and they wanted him quiet. Keanu adjusted the collar of his coat, subtly brushing a finger against the recording bead sewn into the lining. It vibrated once, confirming its live status. From the far end of the ballroom, he caught sight of Arta Demir again. He was standing near the sculptured pedestal now, speaking softly with 2 guests in dark suits. But his eyes, calm, sharp, calculating briefly, met Keanu's across the crowd. And in that fleeting glance, Keanu saw it. Recognition, not of his name, but of his purpose. The game had shifted, and both hunters knew it. Keanu didn't blink. He held Arta Demir's gaze across the ballroom for a full second, long enough to register the acknowledgement, but not long enough to reveal anything more. Then he turned, calm as ever, and walked toward the sculpture displays, away from the crowd, now whispering behind his back. The red stain on his shirt had already begun to dry, deepening into a dark smudge beneath the low lighting. Guests continued to notice, some with confusion, some with amusement, a few with pity, but none with understanding. To them, he was still a mistake. To Arda and Vivienne, he had just become a threat. The plan had always been subtle: blend in, observe, collect. But now that line had been crossed. The stain wasn't just symbolic, it was a mark, a message. They weren't going to ask him to leave. They wanted him to break, wanted him to feel unwelcome, unworthy, insignificant. But humiliation had never worked on Keanu, because he didn't carry ego like they did. He walked past the dessert bar, ignoring the sideways glance of a man in a tux who muttered, "Should have worn an apron if he wanted to blend in." Another chuckled, "Didn't know thrift stores catered Gala staff now." The jokes didn't land. Not really, because no matter how much they wanted to laugh, something about him didn't bend the way others did. He didn't look like a man who had been knocked down. He looked like a man who had been through worse and come out stronger. Near the edge of the ballroom, Keanu found a quiet alcove where the lighting dimmed and the walls bore no paintings, just deep wood paneling that absorbed the sound of the gala's constant chatter. He leaned against the wall and slid one hand into his coat pocket. Another button, different device. This one didn't record. It pinged. A single encrypted message, 3 words: "Begin Phase 2." Across the globe, in a quiet room in Lisbon, a woman named Ava received the signal. She didn't need an explanation. She opened a protected server. The gala's donor ledger, internal camera feeds, and encrypted invoices siphoned silently from the ballroom's network began to upload. Meanwhile, Keanu turned and began slowly making his way back toward the crowd. The room looked the same, but he could feel the shift under the surface. The humiliation had been a trigger, and now the countermove had begun. At the center of it all, Arda Demir still smiled, still laughed politely at the man beside him, but his left hand tapped once against the side of his leg, rhythmic, controlled. Keanu noted it, a signal to someone else, probably security. The kind not listed on any payroll. That meant time was limited. The spotlight hadn't driven Keanu away, it had driven him deeper. They tried to mark him as an outsider, but they'd only confirmed he was inside something bigger than they realized. And now, every step forward wasn't just movement, it was pressure, and the cracks had started to spread. The whispers began as soon as Keanu re-entered the main ballroom. Not loud, not direct, but steady, measured, like wind slipping through cracks in a locked room. He walked past a cluster of donors near the wine bar. A woman in a black gown leaned toward a man with slicked-back hair and said, "I think he's that actor who disappeared after some scandal." The man scoffed. "He looks more like someone who got lost, trying to deliver groceries." Keanu didn't break stride. Near the back wall, another guest commented to no one in particular, "I heard he's an eccentric billionaire testing social reactions, like some experiment." Another theory drifted through the crowd. Failed artist. Used to be big, now he just shows up uninvited. No one actually knew, but that didn't stop them from trying to define him. In rooms like this, mystery wasn't tolerated. It had to be resolved, labeled, explained, even if the explanation was wrong, especially if it was wrong. A truth that didn't fit their narrative was more dangerous than any lie. Keanu used the murmurs as cover. He slipped between groups, moving casually, observing without appearing to observe. His eyes followed the patterns of security guards, where they paused, where they turned, which areas they ignored. 2 guards stood at the east exit, but neither watched the sculpture alcove. One at the rear patio entrance lingered near the bar too long. The balcony cameras swept in slow, predictable arcs. He marked blind spots, escape routes, dead zones. Then he turned his attention back to the art. Another canvas drew him near. Seabird over moonlight, supposedly a lost piece by Dutch expressionist Marinus Terlinden. It was mounted near the west pillar, under its own directional light. Keanu tilted his head slightly. He knew Terlinden's real work. The brushstrokes were always aggressive, layered, unpolished. This one was smooth, almost lazy. The oil didn't catch the light the way it should. The shadows were too soft. Fake. Another forgery. He moved on. 2 steps later, he passed a sculpture titled Ecoform 2, attributed to a Scandinavian minimalist whose works had never left Norway. And yet here it was, center stage in Manhattan. The curvature was wrong, the base too symmetrical, the finish too polished. Another fake. And then, across the room, a painting flanked by 2 velvet ropes caught his attention. The Solace in Rust, allegedly part of a private donation from the estate of a recently deceased collector. The moment he saw it, Keanu knew. Wrong canvas weave, wrong medium, wrong name. This one wasn't just a forgery. It was built to sell the story of a forgery, a layer deeper. 3 fakes in one room, confirmed, possibly more, all with inflated histories and unverifiable lineages. He slipped farther into the crowd. He wasn't looking for attention. He was looking for the cracks, and they were growing more obvious by the second. Above the ballroom, behind the tinted glass of the director's suite, Vivienne Delacourt stood with her arms folded, eyes locked on the man moving through her event like a ghost. She didn't like what she was seeing. He wasn't mingling. He wasn't networking. He wasn't sipping his drink like someone desperate to be included. He wasn't doing anything he was supposed to. And yet, he moved like he belonged here more than anyone else. She had seen people like him before, drifters, disruptors, men who came in quiet and left with stories that reshaped reputations. But something about this one was different. His stillness wasn't awkward. It was strategic. "Who is he?" she asked aloud, her voice low but sharp. Her assistant, a young woman named Camille, stepped forward, tablet in hand. "No ID confirmed. His name is on the donor list, but no digital profile, no photos, no social, nothing current." "Check older archives," Vivienne said, eyes still trained on him. 10 years back, 20. He didn't just appear out of nowhere. Camille hesitated. "Ma'am, should I alert?" "No." Vivienne cut her off. "Don't make a scene." She stepped closer to the glass. Below, Keanu paused in front of the Solace in Rust and tilted his head just slightly, as if confirming a suspicion. Vivienne's jaw tensed. He knew something. She could feel it. But how? And more importantly, why was he here? He didn't match the profile of their usual targets. He wasn't wealthy enough to matter, not visible enough to make noise. He hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't donated under a recognizable name. He didn't even look like someone who belonged in New York, let alone at her gala. So what was he doing? Vivienne turned to Camille and lowered her voice. "I want him followed." Camille blinked. "By who?" "You," Vivienne said. "And use the floor team. No earpieces, no security detail. I don't want him feeling watched. Just make sure he's never alone." Camille nodded, still unsure. "And if he confronts me?" Vivienne smiled, tight and hollow. "He won't. Men like that don't confront. They wait. They listen. They collect. But they don't like being seen." She stepped back from the glass and reached for her clutch. The flash drive inside felt heavier now. Vivienne didn't know who he was yet. But her instincts, polished, sharpened over years of manipulation and control, were screaming. She looked down again. Keanu was gone. He had slipped out of view, just like that. Camille scanned the ballroom below, eyes darting. Where did he go? Vivienne didn't answer. She already knew. Wherever he had gone, he hadn't left. He was still here, still watching, still unraveling everything. And the problem wasn't that he'd seen too much. The problem was that no one had seen him coming. Keanu hadn't vanished. He had simply slipped between the edges of attention where no one thought to look. That was the advantage of being underestimated. When they assumed you didn't belong, they rarely watched you closely. And when they laughed at you, they never imagined you'd be the one listening. He reappeared near the East Gallery, where a quieter portion of the gala unfolded beneath vaulted arches. The lighting here was softer, the crowd thinner. Two guests stood murmuring over a painting of a disassembled violin, praising its metaphor for artistic loss. Keanu walked past them without drawing notice, scanning the corner for blind spots. He found one just behind a curved wall near the floral arrangements. No cameras, no mirrors, no staff in sight. He took a position there and checked the small receiver hidden in his ring. 2 new signals had joined the room's transmission pattern. More flash drives, more beacons. The laundering operation was in full swing now. Transactions were happening beneath the pretense of bidding. But instead of money changing hands visibly, encrypted data was being moved silently, disguised as art appraisals, donor invoices, even legal waivers for future auctions. Everything wrapped in legitimacy. Everything corrupt to the core. He exhaled slowly, then turned back toward the heart of the ballroom. The temperature in the room felt different now, not in degrees, but in tension. He could feel eyes behind him, not just guests, shadows. Vivienne had acted too fast. Her humiliation tactic, the wine, the sharp little comment, those things weren't just petty. They were panicked. She was trying to discredit him before he revealed himself, but it was too late. She had marked herself. Every step she took now, every glance, every misplaced smile, he was watching it all. He passed a mirror set in one of the pillars and caught a glimpse of movement behind him. A woman, early 30s, dark blue gown, hair pulled into a sleek knot. She wasn't holding a drink, wasn't talking to anyone. She moved like she was trying not to move. Vivienne's assistant, Keanu, took another slow step, then another, letting the moment play out. She adjusted her earring. A signal. He took a turn toward the sculpture garden display, blending with a couple admiring the metalwork. He waited until they drifted away, then turned toward the assistant. She was still there, still following, poorly. She thought he hadn't noticed. She thought she was in control. He stepped behind one of the tall columns, waited 3 full seconds, then pivoted sharply. She nearly collided with him. He looked her in the eyes, calm, silent, measured. She opened her mouth to speak some excuse, maybe some fabricated compliment about the art, but he walked past her before she could finish the breath, and just like that, he was gone again. The ghost in the ballroom, moving through glass and gold and laughter, seeing everything, saying nothing, but preparing for the moment when silence would no longer be an option. Keanu moved with purpose now. The crowd had thickened near the center of the ballroom. The main lights dimmed slightly in anticipation of the live auction. People huddled into tighter circles, clutching auction paddles and murmuring about which pieces they intended to bid on. Bubbles of anticipation formed in the chatter, laced with greed, disguised as enthusiasm. He scanned the room and found him. Arda Demir. The Turkish billionaire stood near a bronze sculpture labeled Memory of Ash. It had no true provenance. Keanu already knew that. Another counterfeit with a sob story attached to inflate its value. Arda wasn't admiring it. He was using it as camouflage, positioned at a central vantage point where he could see every angle of the room. His posture was casual, but his eyes were hunting. Keanu made his approach, not directly, not quickly. He took a slow, winding path, stopping once to inspect a painting, again to nod politely at a passing server. Just enough movement to blend into the crowd, but always recalculating, measuring the distance, closing the gap. Then, with no preamble, Keanu stepped beside him. They stood shoulder to shoulder, staring at the sculpture in silence. The sound of champagne glasses and distant laughter filled the space between them. From a distance, it looked like 2 guests quietly admiring the same piece. But beneath that calm, a different kind of current passed between them. Keanu tilted his head slightly toward the sculpture and spoke without looking at Demir. "That piece you're standing beside," he said quietly, "acrylic, not oil." Demir didn't react right away. He took a slow sip of his drink and replied without turning. "You have good eyes," he said, "for someone with bad shoes." Keanu smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I prefer to see what's real." Demir's jaw tightened for half a second, barely visible, but there. He turned slightly, eyes finally meeting Keanu's. "Are you with the gallery?" he asked, voice low and even. "Just a fan of authenticity," Keanu said. The silence stretched. Demir's smile never fully disappeared, but the warmth behind it had been stripped away. What remained was calculation. "You're not listed," Demir said. "I looked." Keanu shrugged. "Some names matter less than timing." Demir's hand tensed around his glass, then relaxed again. "Timing," he echoed. "Is that what tonight is for you?" Keanu's eyes flicked briefly to the sculpture, then back to Demir. "For me, it's about watching who pretends to care and who profits from the pretense." Demir stared at him. Then he laughed once, softly. "You're bold. Only when I need to be." "Then be careful," Demir said. "Boldness has a price." "So does fraud," Keanu replied. The moment broke. Keanu stepped away, leaving Demir blinking. His smile cracked just slightly at the edge. Behind a decorative floral column, Vivienne watched the entire exchange. Her face was stone. She pulled out her phone, typed a single sentence, and hit send. "Remove him before the auction starts." Vivienne didn't wait for a reply. She slipped her phone back into her clutch, turned sharply, and walked up the side stairwell leading back to the mezzanine suite. Her heels clicked hard against the marble steps, echoing with urgency. She didn't look back. On the ballroom floor, Arda Demir remained where Keanu had left him. He stood still, jaw slightly clenched, as if trying to brush off a splinter he couldn't quite locate. The conversation hadn't lasted long, but the impact lingered. His smile hadn't returned. A security guard in a navy suit and an earpiece began making his way subtly across the ballroom. He didn't walk fast. His movements were smooth, practiced, but his eyes stayed fixed on Keanu, who had returned to the painting cluster near the far wall. Keanu knew he was being followed. He knew because the man trailing him wasn't a waiter, wasn't a donor, and certainly wasn't subtle, but he didn't react. Instead, he circled around a sculpture titled Elegy of Silence. The plaque claimed it was a rare piece from an unnamed Eastern European artist who had disappeared after the war. But the weld marks along the spine were modern, almost manufactured. The story was fake. The piece was fake, but the money attached to it very real. Another forgery, but this one was different. This one wasn't just about misattribution. This was a test piece, meant to see how far they could push the lie. He stepped back and scanned the room again. The guard was closer now. Two other men had entered from the main corridor. Suits sharp, eyes too alert. Not part of the guest list. Not hired by the event company. These were private, hand-picked, likely loyal to Vivienne. Keanu moved slowly, crossing toward the alcove near the champagne tower, where fewer people lingered. The servers had pulled back, and only a few guests remained, laughing too loudly, unaware of what was moving beneath their feet. He timed his steps. The guard adjusted his pace. 30 feet, 20. Keanu stopped at a small table bearing a stack of charity brochures. He picked one up, flipped through it absently, then folded it and placed it into his coat. 15 feet, 10. He turned his head slightly, just enough to confirm the trajectory. The man wasn't going to make a scene in the open. No, this would be clean. A quiet invitation to talk privately, followed by an exit, followed by disappearance. Keanu adjusted the sleeve of his jacket, brushing 2 fingers against the small looped thread inside the seam. It buzzed once. Uplink confirmed. The entire ballroom security feed cameras, guard positions, audio frequencies was now being pulled into a secondary relay. If they were going to try and corner him, they were doing it in front of a live mirror. And when mirrors start reflecting the truth, the start dock, ones hiding behind them tend to break first. The moment unfolded exactly as Keanu expected. The main guard, tall, clean-shaven, likely ex-military, closed the final 5 feet. He approached Keanu with a polite, unreadable expression and lowered his voice just above the music's hum. "Sir," he said smoothly, "may I speak with you? Just a brief word, in private." Keanu looked up at him. His face didn't change. Not surprised, not defensive, just still. "About what?" he asked, voice calm. The guard kept his tone even. "There's been a concern." Keanu tilted his head. "Whose concern?" "Discretion is preferred," the guard replied. "I'll escort you to the mezzanine lounge. Only for a moment." Keanu's eyes flicked to the corners of the room. The other two men had stopped moving. They stood still now, blocking secondary exits. One near the sculpture display. One just inside the archway to the gallery corridor. This wasn't a conversation. It was a net. Keanu turned his body slightly, not in retreat, but in alignment. He positioned himself with his back to the main crowd. Now no guest could clearly see his face. It was how they wanted it, to erase him quietly, behind the performance. He glanced once toward the balcony above. Vivienne was watching. She stood behind the glass, like a conductor, directing silence. He returned his gaze to the guard. "I'm not causing a disruption," Keanu said. "I haven't touched the art. I'm not drunk. I haven't spoken to anyone." The guard nodded slowly, hands still relaxed in front of him. "This is just protocol." Keanu stepped forward, not toward the guard, but around him, close enough to brush shoulders. As he passed, he slipped something into the man's palm, a folded napkin. The guard didn't react, not immediately. Keanu kept walking. 1 step, 2, 3. The guard looked down. Scrawled in red ink were 6 words. "Check frame of dusk over fire. Infrared." The handwriting was steady. No signature, just instruction, just truth. The guard hesitated, his fingers clenched around the napkin. Keanu didn't look back. He disappeared behind a group of guests crowding around the wine tower, slipping into the edge of the ballroom like a shadow folding into its own corner. The guard didn't follow. Not yet. Upstairs, Vivienne narrowed her eyes. Something had gone off script. The man hadn't resisted, hadn't argued, hadn't run. He had simply walked away. That was worse, much worse. Because men who knew they were beaten, they flinched. But men who knew something, they smiled. And Keanu Reeves had just left her most trusted handler standing in the middle of the gala, holding a napkin that might set the whole night on fire. She grabbed her phone and typed another message. "Seal the floor. Don't let him near the stage." She hit send, but it was already too late. Because in a ballroom full of lies, one man had just handed them the truth and dared them to read it. Keanu reached the far edge of the ballroom, positioning himself near one of the tall columns that framed the entry into the West Gallery. His back was straight, one hand resting lightly in his coat pocket, and his eyes followed the subtle tension now rippling through the room like an undercurrent beneath all the gold. They were circling him again. The 2 guards who had taken positions earlier were now moving in from separate angles. A third, different from the one who had received the napkin, emerged from the rear stairwell near the wine display. His path was direct, not rushed, but firm. Across the room, Keanu caught a glance from the first guard, the one holding the folded napkin in his pocket. Their eyes met briefly. There was a question there now. Hesitation. But orders were orders. The third guard reached him first. "Sir," he said, voice low and professional, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with us. Just a brief check. Quietly, if you don't mind." Keanu didn't move at first. He scanned the room again. Every guest still believed they were part of a celebration. Glasses clinked. Laughter echoed off polished stone. The illusion held firm. But up in the balcony, Vivienne was already preparing her next move. She leaned toward the audio technician behind the private console. "Cue the spotlight," she whispered. "Then go live on my mark." The technician hesitated. "But we haven't introduced I'll handle the introduction," she said flatly. "Just follow the cue." Down on the ballroom floor, the second and third guards flanked Keanu, though they kept their distance. One gestured to the door that led toward the mezzanine lounge. Keanu turned toward them and slowly pulled out a folded napkin. Another, identical to the one he'd already passed. He handed it to the closest guard without a word. The man opened it carefully. Same message. "Check the back of Dusk Over Fire. Infrared will show you." The guard blinked, his brow furrowed. But before he could ask a single question, the ballroom lighting shifted. A hush swept across the crowd as the chandeliers dimmed to a soft, golden glow. Then, without warning, A single white-hot spotlight dropped from the ceiling and locked onto Keanu. Gasps erupted. He stood perfectly still, center stage now, except there was no stage. Just a patch of marble under his boots and a crimson stain across his shirt, still visible from the earlier wine spill. His coat was open, his collar still rumpled. And now, with every guest staring, his face was lit like a scene in a bad play. Vivienne's voice came over the loudspeakers, calm and chirpy. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "please give a warm welcome to one of our surprise patrons this evening. A man of mystery, generosity, and clearly unique taste." She paused, savoring it. "Let's welcome Keanu Reeves." The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was disbelief. Then came the laughter. The laughter began slowly. A few hesitant chuckles near the back, followed by louder bursts from guests who had consumed enough champagne to feel uninhibited. Someone whispered, "Did she just say Keanu Reeves?" A louder voice echoed, "Is that really him?" Others began turning in circles, nudging their companions, squinting toward the spotlighted figure with puzzled grins. Keanu remained motionless, his eyes unfazed, but inside, 1,000 memories pulsed behind them. He'd been mocked before, on sets, in interviews. As a teenager, trying to blend in despite moving constantly and never quite fitting the mold. But this wasn't random. It was a precision strike delivered with smiles and orchestral strings in the background. Delivered by someone who had just minutes ago called him a stray dog in a tuxedo. Vivienne's voice returned through the microphone, adding insult to injury. "Oh, and Ken," she said with a syrupy grin from her perch above the room, "thank you for gracing us with your presence. Hopefully next time we'll get the real Keanu." Gasps broke through the laughter. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. A few began to realize it wasn't a joke, it was cruelty, cloaked in entertainment. The spotlight stayed fixed on him, his clothes still damp with the residue of expensive wine. His name, twisted in front of 100 influential eyes. He felt no shame, but he understood the play. It was about erasure, about taking someone who didn't belong, dragging him into their light, then laughing until he disappeared. A server walked past and muttered under his breath, "Hang in there, man." Keanu's gaze flicked toward the young man. That voice, that tiny moment of human recognition, it held more weight than all the laughter above. The guard closest to Keanu moved forward again, his tone more apologetic now. "Sir, maybe we can step aside. This is getting awkward." Keanu raised one hand gently, not in resistance, but in control. Then he turned his face slightly toward the spotlight, letting it frame the rough edge of his jaw and the stillness of his expression. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. Not until the message was delivered. Not until they checked the back of that painting. He didn't need to defend his name. He needed only to wait for the truth to surface. Upstairs, Vivienne's smile was faltering. She turned to Arda Demir, who leaned against the glass railing with a smirk. "I told you he wouldn't last the hour," Arda said. Vivienne tried to respond, but her phone buzzed. A message. From the head of private security. 4 words. "We checked the painting." Her heart froze. Vivienne stepped back from the glass, her face draining of color. Arda noticed. "What is it?" he asked. She didn't answer. Down below, Keanu slowly turned and walked toward the side of the ballroom, not hurried, not flinching. The laughter had quieted. Whispers replaced it. The spotlight dimmed, as if the room itself was beginning to realize something had shifted. Someone at the back murmured, "He knew." The security guard who'd taken the napkin now stood frozen, staring at his phone. Vivienne's mask cracked. Because the forgery wasn't just exposed. It was about to go public. The ballroom had never been quieter. Not even the strings dared play. It was as if the very air held its breath. Keanu had started to turn away, the sting of humiliation still clinging to his skin like the red wine soaking into his shirt. But before he could take a full step toward the exit, a sound sliced through the tension. The massive double doors at the front of the hall creaked open, heads swiveled. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even the waitstaff froze, their trays suspended in the air, and then he appeared. Richard Gere, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that caught the light like steel, his silver hair neatly parted, and his expression unreadable. He didn't scan the crowd, he didn't smile for the guests. His gaze was locked on one man only, Keanu Reeves. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some clutched their pearls, others reached for their phones in disbelief. The room that had mocked Keanu just minutes ago was now stunned into silence, caught between curiosity and confusion. Vivian's face drained of color. Arda stiffened. Richard moved like he belonged, not just in the room, but as if he had authored its blueprint. Every step he took toward Keanu rewrote the energy in the air. The laughter that had moments ago echoed cruelly now sounded like the distant memory of a mistake no one wanted to claim. Keanu stood still, calm, watching. Richard reached him, paused just inches away, and looked him directly in the eyes. Neither man blinked. "Took you long enough," Richard said quietly, voice rich with gravity. Keanu offered the faintest smile. "I had to be sure." That was it. No dramatic embrace, no handshake, just those words. But it was enough. The temperature of the room shifted. What had been ridicule was now curiosity. What had been arrogance was now uncertainty. The crowd didn't know what they were witnessing, but instinctively, they knew it mattered. And then Richard turned. Slowly, casually, and together, he and Keanu began, walking side by side into the very center of the ballroom. They didn't avoid anyone. They didn't rush. They walked through that polished jungle of wealth, corruption, and pretend elegance like two men who'd just been handed the key to the vault. A few guests stepped back. Others bowed their heads. Some tried to catch Richard's eye, to align themselves, but he ignored them. Vivian didn't move from her glass balcony, but her knuckles were white against the rail. Arda looked from Keanu to Richard and back again, sweat breaking at his brow. Whispers exploded. "What is happening? Is that really Richard Gere? Why is he with Keanu? Are they here together?" A trembling voice asked, "Did we just mock the wrong man?" The auction hadn't started, but the balance of power already had, and it had tipped. Keanu and Richard paused in front of one of the centerpiece artworks, Dusk Over Fire. The very painting Keanu had referenced when security tried to escort him out. It towered on its golden easel, bathed in warm light. To most in the room, it looked flawless. To the trained eye, it was a mask. Richard leaned forward slightly, examining it. His voice was calm, but deliberate. "Acrylic layered with antique pigments," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "An impressive forgery, expensive, but fake." The silence thickened. Whispers became sharp gasps. Keanu handed him a folded napkin, the same one he'd given to the guards moments earlier. Richard opened it slowly, revealing a series of scribbled notes and a line in pen that said, "Infrared reveals the original name. Dawn in Smoke. Stolen Istanbul, 1999. Richard turned, facing the crowd. His voice was clear now. "Some of you know exactly what that means." Vivian's glass box upstairs remained still, but inside, she had started pacing. Keanu turned and pointed to the wall-mounted plaque below the painting. "The gallery lists this as a private donation from the Demir collection, except that collection never existed, not legally." Arda Demir flinched. Richard tilted his head. "So tell me, Arda, was it you? Or were you just the courier?" The Turkish billionaire tried to smile, but it was hollow. "You must be mistaken. That piece was authenticated last month." Keanu stepped forward. "Yes, by a shell agency out of Budapest. It's a circle, Mr. Demir. You launder through art, fund operations in border territories, then return with inflated tax credits and a clean face." People turned toward Arda now. The room's spotlight, figurative and literal, had shifted entirely. Richard spoke again. "There's a reason I walked into this room tonight, and it's not to pose for photographs. I've seen too many of these games, men with power thinking they can hide behind beauty, behind frames and chandeliers." Then his tone softened. "But what you all don't understand is that Keanu has been here for weeks, quietly, watching, tracing transactions, following trails no one else even knew existed. That revelation struck like lightning. Gasps. One woman covered her mouth. Another whispered, "This wasn't an accident." He planned this. Keanu didn't move. He simply said, "I came because someone whispered the name Demir in a refugee camp in Athens. A girl was drawing in the dirt. She said her father used to paint before the men in the silver boats took him." The room was stunned, and that's when I remembered seeing this piece, he added. Not here, but in a back room in Istanbul. Wrapped in tarpaulin, forgotten. The elegance of the Gala now looked cheap. The chandeliers garish. The wine stains on Keanu's shirt, no longer a mark of humiliation but of endurance. Proof that he had walked through the fire and still held his ground. Richard looked at Keanu once more and said, "Time to pull back the curtain." Keanu nodded, then tapped his wrist. A silent signal. From discreet corners of the ballroom, men and women in formal wear moved with sudden purpose. They weren't guests, they were agents. Within seconds, doors locked, security froze, and a low hum began as hidden scanners activated. Vivian's glass chamber dimmed behind a sudden blackout curtain. Richard spoke firmly. "This gala is now under investigation by Interpol and the International Art Crimes Division." A hush fell so deep it trembled. Keanu stepped forward, calm and steady. No more masks, no more hiding. The game had truly changed, and now the reckoning began. The moment Richard Gere stepped onto the stage, Vivian froze in place. For a fraction of a second, she tried to maintain composure, lifting her chin and signaling to her head of security. But they didn't move. They couldn't. The silent command from Keanu had neutralized her entire private staff without a word. She reached for her phone. No signal. She whispered to her assistant, "Get him off that stage now." The assistant didn't move either. Instead, all eyes turned to Richard as he reached the podium in calm, deliberate silence. The chatter in the ballroom died down like a candle snuffed by a wind. He looked across the glittering sea of gowns and tuxedos, holding the microphone lightly between his fingers. Behind him, Keanu stood silently at the base of the steps, not moving, not needing to. Richard exhaled, then began. "I wasn't going to speak tonight." The room leaned in. "I came here as a quiet observer, to support an event that on paper celebrates global art and cultural preservation. I came to appreciate beauty, to support legacy, and to honor generosity." He paused, scanning the guests, locking eyes with a few stunned collectors, diplomats, and critics. "But I witnessed something else tonight. Something ugly, and I can't walk away without speaking on it." He looked directly at Vivienne. "Tonight, a man I've respected for decades was publicly ridiculed, mocked, humiliated by people who believed they could define worth by a wine stain or a mispronounced name. There were murmurs now. A ripple of discomfort moved across the room. Several guests shifted in their seats. The same ones who had laughed minutes earlier now avoided Richard's gaze. "And here's the thing," Richard continued. "You don't know who you were mocking." He motioned toward Keanu with a quiet reverence. "You saw a man dressed plainly. You assumed his silence was weakness. You assumed his humility was ignorance." He paused again, voice steady, but rising with restrained power. "But what you don't know is that this man has funded over 20 art preservation projects around the world, quietly, anonymously. While some of you fly private jets to auctions just to take selfies with the art you don't even understand, he was saving frescoes in northern Syria. He was funding restoration of stolen indigenous carvings in Alaska. And yes, he even helped fund this gala's entire scholarship arm." Vivian turned pale. Richard locked eyes with her. "You knew that, didn't you?" She didn't speak. Richard leaned closer to the mic, speaking now not to the room but to her. "You invited him here tonight not to honor his contributions but to humiliate him, to degrade him. You used his name as a punchline." He turned back to the audience, his tone rising with conviction. "Is this what we've become? A room so addicted to status and surface that we punish humility as if it's shameful?" Someone in the back of the room whispered, "That's not right." And then another voice, louder. "He was laughing too, a few minutes ago." Richard continued, undeterred.
Keanu Reeves has spent his life giving more than he's taken. He's lifted people without demanding credit, and when confronted by cruelty, he stood still not because he couldn't fight back, but because he chose not to humiliate others the way they tried to humiliate him. He paused again, eyes flicking once more to Vivienne. "I won't stay silent while a man of integrity is disrespected in a house that he helped build." The room was dead silent. Then Richard looked back toward Keanu. "Come up here." Keanu didn't move for a moment. The invitation was not for glory. It was a challenge to step into a spotlight he never sought. Then he moved. Quiet, graceful, controlled. The lion had roared. Now, the world would listen. Keanu climbed the steps slowly, his hands relaxed by his sides. He didn't look at Vivienne. He didn't need to. The crowd remained silent, the kind of silence that pressed down on the walls, made the chandeliers feel too bright, too heavy. No one was filming anymore. Phones had dropped. All eyes were real, unfiltered. When Keanu reached the top of the stage, he didn't take the mic. Richard extended it toward him, but Keanu gently shook his head. Instead, he turned and faced the room, just looked at them. A few in the front rows couldn't meet his eyes. Keanu's voice was quiet when he finally spoke. No microphone, just air and honesty. "I didn't come here to be seen." The people leaned in, straining to hear. "I came here because someone I once respected asked me to attend." A pause. "And because I care about what's being sold tonight and what's being stolen." He let the words settle. "There are pieces on these walls that don't belong here, not because they aren't beautiful, but because they aren't real." Gasps flickered across the ballroom. A handful of art experts shifted uncomfortably. Keanu continued, eyes scanning the room. "And just like some of these paintings, sometimes the people behind events like this wear beautiful frames around hollow cores." His gaze briefly passed over Vivienne. She stood frozen, arms crossed tightly, eyes burning, jaw clenched. Richard didn't interrupt. He stood beside Keanu with arms at his side, giving him space but silently anchoring the moment. Keanu looked at the back of the room now, where security stood unsure of their orders. "If you want to remove me, I'll walk out right now." He turned back toward the guests. "But I think what you really need to remove is the illusion that money equals meaning." A murmur rose, not of discomfort this time, but awakening. One man clapped, then a woman, then the ripple widened. Vivienne stepped forward. "Enough. That's enough." But no one was listening to her anymore. Richard raised the mic once more, his voice steady. "Enough?" he said, eyes fixed on Vivienne. "Number tonight is the first time this room has been honest in years." He turned back to the audience. "And honesty has always been the foundation of art." Keanu stood beside him, silent but unshaken. The stain on his shirt no longer shame but symbol. The applause grew louder, filling the hall. Vivienne's control had shattered. For the first time, she was no longer directing the room. The lion had stepped onto the stage, and the world was listening. The applause was still echoing. When Keanu reached into the inside pocket of his coat, the gesture was slow, deliberate, unthreatening. Yet the room leaned forward as if he'd pulled the pin from a grenade. He drew out a small flash drive silver, unassuming, but heavy with the weight of truth. He held it up between two fingers. "This contains everything," Keanu said quietly, his voice steady. "Fraud, offshore accounts, false charities, stolen works paraded as masterpieces." He looked from face to face. Every ledger, every forged appraisal, every lie told in this room tonight. The silence was absolute. Then Vivienne's voice cut through, sharp as glass. "He's not even on the guest list." Gasps followed. Heads turned upward toward the balcony where she stood, trying to anchor control. She raised her chin. "He doesn't belong here. He isn't part of this world. He's an intruder with a prop. You'll all regret giving him your attention." But before the crowd could settle back into doubt, Richard stepped forward, his presence like a strike of lightning against her storm. He said firmly. He was on the donor list. The room erupted with whispers. "Donor list? What donor list?" Richard pressed on. He paid for tonight's security and dinner. The silence that followed wasn't disbelief. It was realization. People turned to one another, repeating the words, their voices climbing into a wave of astonishment. He paid for security? He covered the dinner? Someone in the back laughed, not in mockery, but in shocked admiration. The man Vivienne tried to humiliate is the reason we're drinking this wine? The laughter spread, rolling across the ballroom like thunder. It wasn't cruel anymore. It was liberation, nervous, disbelieving, but genuine. Keanu didn't smile. He simply lowered the flash drive and placed it on the podium beside Richard. I never needed credit, he said softly, but I won't.
Let others build empires on lies while silencing the truth. Richard nodded. You all heard him. He didn't come here to grandstand. He came here to hold up a mirror. The audience quieted again.
The chandelier light shimmered across faces that suddenly looked guilty, reflective, unsettled. Guests who had once mocked now avoided his gaze, as though they had been caught laughing at their own reflection. Vivienne gripped the railing tighter. This is slander, she hissed. You'll destroy reputations on the word of a man who isn't even dressed for the occasion? Richard's head turned sharply, his eyes like steel. Reputation doesn't live in silk gowns or imported wine. It lives in truth. He motioned to Keanu. And truth doesn't need to dress the part. The applause came again, louder this time. The first ripple of rebellion against Vivienne's control. Some clapped hesitantly, others firmly. And with each clap, the mask of the gala fractured further. Keanu remained still, his hand resting lightly on the podium, the flash drive gleaming under the spotlight. The mirror was being held up, and no one liked what they saw in it. Vivienne's composure cracked at the edges. Her perfectly lined lips trembled as she scanned the room, seeking familiar eyes that might rescue her. But the same donors who had fawned over her hours earlier now refused to meet her gaze. Their silence spoke louder than any denial. It was the sound of shifting allegiance. A man near the front, a known collector with an ego the size of his yacht, raised his voice. Vivienne, is this true? You told me Sunset Verso was from the private collection of Loria Baines. You said the provenance was verified. Vivienne narrowed her eyes. At Island I stand by that. Keanu calmly tilted his head. Page 4 of the digital ledger, line 17. It shows that piece being rerouted through 2 shell companies before it was passed to a forger named Rami Ardoun in Marrakesh. There's even a timestamp. Murmurs spread like brush fire. Another voice cut through. A woman older, regal, with silver hair and a sapphire necklace looked directly at Keanu. And the charities? You said false donations. Keanu nodded. Of the 7 organizations listed in tonight's program, 3 haven't existed since 2019. One is a mailbox in the Cayman Islands. The last is a real foundation created by a man who passed away last year. Vivienne's name isn't listed on their board, nor has she donated to them. Richard added, We vetted every file. Multiple analysts confirmed the findings. The flash drive isn't just claims. It's proof. Someone near the back cursed under their breath. Vivienne's voice shook as she spoke again. Even if any of this were true, this is not the time or place. This is a celebration. Richard took a breath and stepped closer to the mic. Celebration of what? Greed? Manipulation? Wearing tailored dresses while others are robbed blind under the illusion of art? His words landed hard. A young staff member in a black uniform emerged from the side of the ballroom. He whispered something to a guest near the front. That guest, a tech CEO known for making headlines, stood abruptly and approached the stage. He nodded respectfully to Keanu, then faced the crowd. My security team ran a scan, he announced. We checked the metadata on the flash drive. The files are legitimate, unaltered, verified down to the second. The final nail. Gasps rippled. Conversations turned urgent. Some guests pulling out their phones, others walking out altogether. Vivienne's world was crumbling in real time. Keanu finally stepped forward again. You can choose to leave tonight unchanged. Or you can ask why a man like me would go to such lengths. He looked directly at Vivienne, not with anger,
but with deep, quiet sadness. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth.
That's all I ever wanted to protect.
Vivienne opened her mouth, but no words came. Vivienne stepped back, her heels unsteady, as the spotlight shifted off her and onto the man she had once mocked. Keanu didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice or revel in her downfall. He simply turned to the crowd and said, "Truth has no dress code." The room, once filled with smug laughter, now stood in hushed awe. Some guests applauded tentatively at first, then louder. A standing ovation began to swell. Richard placed a hand on Keanu's shoulder. And in that moment, the man in worn shoes became the one person everyone wanted to hear more from. Keanu stepped forward slowly, every movement deliberate. The crowd, which had only moments ago erupted in applause, fell into an expectant hush. The ballroom lights dimmed as Keanu raised a small remote and pointed it at the massive screen that hung at the edge of the stage. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the screen flickered to life. An image of the painting Dusk Over Fire appeared grand, fiery, and mysterious. But then, with a quiet click, the image shifted. The colors faded. The screen dissolved into monochrome as an infrared scan swept across the digital canvas. Layer by layer, heat signatures revealed something beneath the surface of the paint. The room collectively leaned in. And there it was, a hidden signature. Not the artist's, a completely different name. Underneath the swirling strokes of false brilliance, the scan revealed an older work that had been painted over an original piece from a long-lost collection stolen during a private estate robbery decades ago. A piece known only by a grainy photo and an inventory report, one thought to be destroyed or lost forever. The kind of painting worth millions, not because of the brushstrokes on top, but the truth buried underneath. Gasps rippled through the audience. Whispers scattered like firecrackers across the ballroom.
Is that real?
No way.
That's not the listed artist.
Keanu didn't flinch.
He let the moment breathe. Then he pressed the remote again. A new video loaded on the screen. Blurry at first. The camera was angled from behind a curtain. But as the resolution sharpened, the figure on the screen came into focus. Vivienne, perfectly dressed, poised, her voice clear and commanding. She was speaking to two men, one in a pinstripe suit, the other in art handler gloves. Her voice echoed through the speakers. "Forge it. Add the fake charities to the plaque. And move it before the police sniff around." The ballroom went still. No one moved. Then her voice continued, just as calm. "This painting doesn't need to be real. It needs to be expensive, and no one in that room can tell the difference." Gasps broke out again, louder this time. A woman dropped her wine glass. It shattered against the marble floor. Vivienne, still on stage, stood frozen, her face pale. Her eyes darted toward the exits. The damage was done. Phones shot into the air. Dozens of guests began recording the screen. Others turned their cameras toward Vivienne, capturing her growing horror in real time. The mask she'd worn for years was crumbling right in front of the very people she'd manipulated, flattered, and lied to. Keanu remained silent. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. The truth was doing all the speaking now. The video continued. In the next clip, Vivienne was seated at a polished oak table, casually sipping champagne, her heels crossed. She was laughing with Arda Demir. The two of them were reviewing invoices marked with fake charity logos. "I told you," Vivienne smirked. "As long as you call it a foundation, no one cares what you're moving." Art, funds, favors, it all gets cleaned in the same wash. Arda chuckled, adjusting his cufflinks. "You're dangerous." Vivienne lifted her glass. "I'm rich." The video cut. Then, a series of still images appeared. Bank transfers to offshore accounts, screenshots of donor lists with inflated numbers, side-by-side comparisons of real and fake appraisals, all laid bare for the room to see. The final image showed the Dusk Over Fire painting in its shipping crate, timestamped the week before it was allegedly donated. Vivienne tried to speak. She stepped forward, her voice trembling. This is edited. This is fabricated. He's twisting everything."
A man from the second row stood up. His name was Charles Ling. He was a collector, a respected one, and one of the biggest contributors to the Gala. "I own the sister piece to that painting," Charles said. "The one they claimed was part of the same series, but mine was authenticated 20 years ago. The brushwork is completely different. The one they're selling tonight? It's a fraud." Heads turned. Eyes narrowed. No one was looking at Keanu now. All eyes were on Vivienne. Richard stepped forward again. He spoke quietly, but the mic picked up every word. "You told the world this gala was about healing, about rebuilding the museum after the fire. But the money raised tonight was never meant for restoration. It was meant to disappear, along with you." Vivienne looked around for support. She saw none. Even her closest allies were taking small steps back, their bodies angling away from her like ships leaving a sinking island. Keanu turned to the screen one last time. A final image filled the frame. It was the original artist's signature, a perfect match from the estate's archive. Clear, undeniable, and damning. The room went still. The signature matched the name of a reclusive Eastern European artist whose death had made headlines 2 decades ago. His last known work was said to have been lost in a private collection. But here it was, his original, ghosted beneath layers of false pigment, uncovered only by infrared. Vivienne's voice cracked. "You don't understand, this wasn't supposed to happen like this." Security began to move in her direction. She backed away. "This is a setup. He's not even one of us. He's just some sad actor playing philanthropist." Keanu finally turned to her. "I never needed to be one of you," he said. "I just needed to see the truth. And now, so has everyone else." The murmurs in the room turned to full-throated conversation. Journalists pulled out notepads. A well-known podcast host began live streaming. The art world had just imploded, and the fallout was already spreading. Richard placed a hand on Keanu's shoulder. "Let's give them one more gift," he said. Keanu nodded. A new image appeared on screen, a document showing the transfer of ownership for Dusk Over Fire, signed by Keanu and dated the day before the gala. A note below it read, "Donated to the National Children's Art Program, for public education use only." Applause broke out, not for spectacle, not for scandal, but for integrity. Keanu took a step back from the spotlight, and the room, for the first time that night, felt real. No pretense, no performance, just truth. The air shifted. That thick hush, the kind that falls before a verdict, is broken only by the sharp click of polished shoes echoing through the ballroom. Interpol agents, 3 of them, unmistakable in their dark suits, discreet earpieces, and solemn purpose. The tallest one, a woman with slate-gray eyes, steps forward with an open folder in her hand. "Vivienne Moreau," she announces. "You are under investigation for international art fraud, tax evasion, wire fraud, and conspiracy to launder charitable donations." Gasps ripple like a wave through the crowd. Vivienne freezes. Her champagne flute trembles. She tries to lift her chin, but her body betrays her. The hand holding the glass drops to her side, limp, her fingers unclasping. It shatters on the marble floor, red wine soaking into the hem of her silk gown. "No," she says quietly, then louder, desperate. "No, this is a mistake. This can't be." The agent continues. "We have digital evidence, including intercepted audio and financial records, implicating you in the redirection of charitable funds to offshore accounts, the forgery of paintings under the Demir collection, and the sale of counterfeit pieces to fund shell entities." Arta Demir's head snaps around. "What?" He breathes, stunned. He looks from Vivienne to the screen still frozen behind them, showing his prized piece, Dusk Over Fire, exposed by infrared to be a fraud. Vivienne staggers back a step. She's wearing pearls, but they suddenly look like shackles. She grips the edge of the stage, her voice cracking. "I built this place. Every panel, every exhibit, every gala. Without me, there is nothing. No one moves, no one speaks, until a voice does quiet, clear, firm. It's the curator in the long velvet dress, the same one who had chuckled earlier when Keanu was mocked. Her voice slices through the silence. "And we let you."
Vivian stares at her. The curator continues, rising to her feet slowly. You bought our silence with influence. We laughed when you laughed. We turned our heads when you did. I laughed at him earlier. She gestures toward Keanu, standing calmly, his hands clasped in front of him, eyes steady. I was wrong. Across the room, another guest stands. Then another. A ripple of reckoning. Someone near the back starts clapping. Slow, deliberate. Then another. It spreads not as celebration, but as repentance. Not for Vivienne, but for Keanu. For all the quiet dignity he held while they chose ridicule. He doesn't bow. He doesn't smile. He simply nods. Once. Vivienne's gaze darts wildly across the room, searching for an ally. But there are no hands extended now. The people who once flocked to her, who praised her every speech, are standing in silence or slow applause, not for her, but for the man she humiliated. You're all cowards, she hisses, voice trembling, mascara streaking. I made this city care about art again. I brought money into this dump. You think he saved you? She jabs a shaking finger toward Keanu. He's a ghost, a myth wrapped in cheap clothes and pity. The words land flat. The room no longer listens to her. The Interpol agent steps closer. Miss Moreau, we suggest you come peacefully. You are not under arrest yet, but we are prepared to detain you for questioning regarding crimes that span 3 jurisdictions. Vivienne lifts her chin. For a second, her pride flares again. Then someone speaks behind her. It's Richard Gere. Pride makes a great mask, he says gently, but it's never enough to hide truth forever. Vivienne turns, startled, as if forgetting he was even still present. She opens her mouth to speak, but nothing comes out. Richard looks toward Keanu. You gave her every chance. Keanu nods. She took every advantage. The guests murmur again. Some lower their eyes. Some whisper apologies. One of the board members from the museum steps forward, a silver-haired man in a dark green suit, once seen laughing with Vivienne at nearly every gala. He clears his throat, voice shaky. We'll be launching a full audit, he says, of all financials, acquisitions, and board activity, immediately. Vivienne's face turns pale. Her legs wobble beneath her gown. You can't, she breathes. You owe me. The man answers without emotion. We owe the truth. The curator, still standing, quietly walks to the edge of the stage. She turns to Keanu, voice low but sincere. I didn't know. I never knew what you were doing behind the scenes. What you gave, what you risked. Keanu's response is simple. It was never about being seen. A moment later, Vivienne stumbles. Her heel catches, and she nearly falls, but no one moves to catch her. She grips the side of a table, struggling to hold herself up. The image is striking. The woman once in control of every person, every detail, now abandoned by the very people she used. And then the slow clap begins again, firmer now, spreading with new energy. A man from the catering team claps. A young art student joins. An elderly guest, seated most of the evening, rises slowly to his feet, clapping with wet eyes. They aren't applauding spectacle. They are applauding truth. Keanu doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. Vivienne, surrounded by silence and stares, seems to shrink in real time. Her once commanding posture collapses inward, like a crown slipping off a fallen queen. She looks again at Keanu, but there's no malice in his face, only stillness, like a mirror she can't bear to look into. The Interpol agents escort her gently but firmly. Her departure isn't met with cheers or jeers, but with a kind of reverent hush, as if something sacred just took place. As the doors close behind her, the entire ballroom seems to exhale. Then, someone calls out softly, Mr. Reeves. Keanu turns. It's the same security guard who checked him earlier that night, the plus. One who looked unsure, embarrassed. He steps forward and says, Thank you. Keanu offers a simple nod. Then Richard Gere places a hand on Keanu's shoulder and looks at the audience. You all saw it. The lie fall. The truth stand. People begin to gather closer, not out of curiosity, but reverence. Some apologize, others thank him. But Keanu simply walks toward the back of the room, as if he never needed the spotlight. A man who came not to win, but to restore. And in that quiet retreat, the real victory echoed louder than any applause. Vivienne's heels clicked unevenly as the Interpol agents led her toward the exit. Her mascara, once flawless, now streaked down her cheeks in rivers of black, tracing the collapse of a woman who once ruled this room like a throne. No one moved to help her. Not the board member who used to toast her brilliance, not the influencer who called her a visionary, not the artist who begged to be curated by her. Their gazes dropped to the floor, to their glasses, to their phones, anywhere but her. She had orchestrated this gala for her own glory. Now, as the chandeliers flickered above and the marble echoed with the finality of her footsteps, her exit felt like a warning, not a fall from grace. People whispered, not loudly, not cruelly, just truthfully. She used us. I donated because I believed her. He warned us. We laughed. At the center of the ballroom, Keanu stood unmoved, no fist raised, no smug grin, no punchline to claim, just stillness, like a monument to something older than applause. Richard Gere stood beside him, his hands loosely clasped, his expression unreadable. The two of them said nothing as Vivienne disappeared behind the gilded doors. Only when the doors shut with a soft but echoing thud did Richard finally speak. "You could have ended her years ago," he murmured, voice low enough that only Keanu could hear. Keanu's eyes didn't shift. "If I had, they wouldn't have seen themselves in her." Richard turned slightly, studying him. "So, you waited for the mirror to be clean enough?" "No," Keanu said, his voice gentle but clear. "I waited for them to choose which side of it they wanted to stand on." There was a long pause between them, the kind of pause that didn't demand filling, the kind that held understanding. Richard nodded once. "You gave them a mirror." Keanu shook his head. "Number, I gave them a choice." At that, something changed in the air around them. Not loud, not sudden, just a shift. Guests who had once whispered now approached, not as fans or elites, but as people. A curator walked up, hands trembling slightly, and said, "I'm sorry. I saw the truth in your eyes long before tonight. I just wasn't ready to accept it." Keanu offered her a kind look, but didn't reply. He didn't need to. Her words weren't about him. They were about her own reckoning. One by one, others followed. Not in a wave, but in a quiet current. A man in a navy suit, the same one who had chuckled under his breath during Vivienne's speech, came forward. "I was wrong about you," he said, avoiding Keanu's eyes at first. "I thought you were a relic, some washed-up actor clinging to relevance. But now, I realize I've been applauding all the wrong people." Keanu offered a nod. "We all get lost sometimes," he replied. The man exhaled. "Thank you for reminding us what real legacy looks like." Nearby, a younger woman, perhaps a junior curator, stepped forward. Her voice trembled. "The grants I received, they came from anonymous donors. I never imagined you were behind them. I wish I had known. I might have worked harder to protect what mattered." Keanu's expression softened. "You did your part. You're still here." The woman looked away quickly, tears gathering. It was as if the illusion had cracked wide open, and people were seeing not just Keanu, but themselves through clearer glass. What had started as a gala of grandeur had turned into something else entirely. A gathering of reckoning, of accountability. And above it all, the paintings still hung. But now, they looked different. The colors didn't scream wealth. They whispered meaning, purpose, cost. Vivienne's absence left a void no one rushed to fill. Even the music that started to play again couldn't mask the gravity of what had shifted. Some guests stayed silent. Others walked out with their heads down. A few stood rooted in place, as if afraid to leave this moment behind. Richard Gere stepped toward the wall where Dusk Over Fire still hung. He stared at it for a long time, his brow furrowed. "This painting," he said aloud, "used to remind me of the people I'd lost." Keanu moved beside him. "And now?" Keanu asked. Richard didn't turn. "Now it reminds me of the things we're still responsible for.
Keanu nodded. Then maybe it's finally telling the truth. In the far corner, a reporter who had previously scoffed into her champagne was now frantically writing in her notepad. Not a puff piece, not a red carpet summary, but the beginning of a confession, of a story she knew she needed to get right. And the story wasn't about Keanu saving the night. It was about a man who had let the truth walk at its own pace. No one rushed to praise him. That wasn't the point. But for once, the silence in the room wasn't empty. It was honest. As the last of the crowd began to leave, the curator in the velvet dress who had once dismissed Keanu so easily approached him again. She didn't speak at first. Her gaze lingered on the ballroom floor, where confetti and reputation lay scattered alike. Finally, she whispered, "You didn't humiliate her." Keanu looked at her, calm. "That was never the goal." She swallowed hard. "But you could have. I just held up the mirror," he said softly. "The rest was always up to her." Her lip quivered. "I'll never forget this." Keanu gave a faint smile. "Then, maybe it was worth it." Richard rejoined him then, and the two men quietly stepped toward the exit. No cameras followed, no fanfare played. The night had ended not with thunder, but with clarity. And in that quiet, something sacred had been restored. As they reached the doors, Richard placed a hand on Keanu's shoulder. "You gave them a choice," he repeated. Keanu opened the door, letting in the night air, and they finally made one. Behind them, the ballroom remained lit, but forever changed. Ahead of them, the city waited not for heroes, but for men who dared to walk in truth. The marble floors no longer echoed with laughter. The grandeur of the ballroom remained, but its soul had shifted. Keanu and Richard stepped through the tall double doors, side by side, silent as ghosts, leaving a battlefield. There was no music, no applause, no attempt to stop them, only the soft rustling of expensive fabric as guests parted like waves. Behind them, the quote appeared on the massive LED screen above the stage, white letters on a black background, unmoving, unforgiving. Character is what you do when no one is watching. Integrity is what you do when everyone island, a stillness, followed that pierced deeper than any insult hurled earlier that night. Some people lowered their champagne glasses mid-sip, others blinked as though waking up from a trance. One man near the back, still holding a half-eaten canapé, placed it gently on a tray and rubbed his wedding ring, as if remembering something lost. Several phones, once used to record Keanu's humiliation, now trembled in hands, unsure whether to delete or deny. One by one, screens dimmed, videos vanished. No one gave the command. But it was as if the entire room agreed this moment would not go viral. It would go internal. A woman in a navy silk dress, who earlier had giggled at Keanu's awkward entry, slowly turned toward a mirror hanging in the hallway. She studied her reflection not for vanity, but clarity. Her eyes were red. She whispered something to herself, something only she needed to hear, and walked away barefoot, heels in hand. By the main bar, a man in a burgundy jacket, who'd loudly laughed when Vivienne mocked Keanu, now quietly flagged down a server. "Do you have a pen?" he asked. Then, on the back of a menu card, he began scribbling. "To my daughter," it read at the top. The young woman with the champagne flute, brown curls, ivory dress, a rising curator from Montreal, had mocked Keanu's jacket just an hour earlier. Now, she stared at her own face, reflected in the curve of her glass. She looked older, not in years, but in shame. Her friends had walked off without her. She didn't notice. She sat down at an empty table. Her phone buzzed. She turned it over and pushed it away. At the rear exit, a security guard who had once turned Keanu away from a gallery show years ago now gave a respectful nod as Keanu passed. Keanu met his eyes, nodded back once. No resentment, just history acknowledged, and moved through. Richard paused at the threshold. The same man who once graced red carpets with roaring crowds and gold-plated invitations now looked around this quiet hall with an expression somewhere between sorrow and relief. "You said it wouldn't be loud," he murmured to Keanu. Keanu answered, "I didn't want it to be." Then, together, they stepped out into the night.
Outside, the evening had cooled. A breeze drifted in from the garden, brushing against the back of Keanu's neck. He didn't flinch. The distant sounds of the city were faint now, as though even the outside world had lowered its voice in the wake of what had unfolded. Richard walked slightly behind him, shoulders a little looser than before. Not triumphant, not proud, just lighter. Back inside the ballroom, the atmosphere remained still, but beneath that stillness churned a current of private reckonings. People weren't leaving yet. They were sitting, thinking, unraveling. Near the sculpture display, a man in a gray tuxedo stood motionless before a minimalist piece titled Truth in Fracture. He stared as if seeing it for the first time. His wife approached, but didn't speak. They simply stood there together, hands slowly linking, not as decoration, but as apology. On the balcony, a group of influencers, who had once snickered at Keanu's thrift store boots, now sat with their phones off. Not one was live streaming. One of them, a woman with 1 million followers and a diamond choker, wiped her eyes with the corner of her napkin. "I think I forgot why I started," she whispered. Inside the restroom, the curator in the velvet dress leaned over the sink. Her mascara was smudged. She looked in the mirror. "I laughed at him," she mouthed. Then she took a breath and pulled her name badge from her chest. She dropped it in the trash. She walked out without it. Meanwhile, an older gentleman who had built a fortune in pharmaceuticals and once paid for an entire wing at the gallery stood alone with a folded program in his hand. He kept flipping it over and over. On the last page was the donor list. Keanu's name was there, quietly placed near the bottom. No highlight, no fanfare, just presence, just support. He looked at it for a long time. Then he took out a pen and underlined the name. He didn't know why, he just knew it mattered now. Back in the main hall, a server approached the young woman still staring into her glass. He didn't ask if she needed anything. He simply sat the bottle down gently on the table and walked away. She finally blinked. In that small motion, everything changed. Because the champagne no longer sparkled with celebration. It shimmered now with confrontation. A man near the stage cleared his throat and stood. His voice cracked. "I used to say I stood for truth in art. I think I just stood for access." He nodded to no one in particular. "Maybe it's time I sat down and listened for once." Someone clapped. Not a roar, not a performance. One clap, then two, then silence again. The people weren't clapping for Keanu. He had already left. They were clapping because something inside them was cracking quietly, painfully, and perhaps necessarily. A quote now glowed on the digital screen behind the empty podium. White letters on black. "Character is what you do when no one is watching. Integrity is what you do when everyone island." No music, no speech, just people looking at themselves, in reflections windows, glasses, screens gone dark. The young woman near the back, finally, set her champagne flute down. Her phone lay beside it, face down. She didn't touch it. For the first time all evening, she wasn't performing. She was remembering who she used to be and wondering who she might become. The hallway beyond the ballroom was quiet. The clinking of heels on marble, once a symbol of stature and status, now sounded like echoes of a fading illusion. As Keanu and Richard stepped into the cool air of the night, they didn't speak. There was nothing to prove, nothing left to say. The truth had already spoken for them. Inside, guests still lingered in the aftermath. The quote projected onto the back wall, "Character is what you do when no one is watching. Integrity is what you do when everyone island," had hit them like a whisper to the soul. Some avoided eye contact. Others quietly deleted the photos they had snapped earlier of Keanu, mocking his worn suit, his quiet posture, his refusal to fight back. At the bar, a woman in a shimmering gold dress set down her champagne glass. She didn't finish it. She watched the entrance where Keanu had once stood, then glanced at her reflection in the mirror behind the bar. Mascara intact, dress flawless, but something inside had cracked. In the corner, a group of men who had laughed the loudest earlier now stood in silence, drinks untouched. One of them, clearly a board member,
looked down at his expensive watch and whispered, "I never asked where the money came from. I just like the spotlight." Meanwhile, near the door, a young woman, possibly an intern, still held her event badge in her hand. Her knuckles were white. Her phone screen lit up briefly, showing a drafted post. "This night changed me." She didn't hit send. Not yet. Outside, as the valet pulled up a modest black car, not a limo, not a Tesla, Richard turned toward Keanu. His voice was soft. "You could have ended her years ago." Keanu didn't look at him. He stared up at the building, its bright lights still beaming onto the sidewalk. "If I had," he said, "they wouldn't have seen themselves in her." Richard let the words settle. He nodded. "You gave them a mirror." "No," Keanu answered. "I gave them a mirror. Choice." Behind them, a woman's voice echoed faintly from inside. "She's gone, but I still feel dirty." It wasn't directed at anyone. It wasn't performative. It was honest. Maybe for the first time that evening, honesty had finally become fashionable. The air outside was sharp and cleansing. Like truth off an island, Keanu walked slowly, not in triumph, but in deep thought. Each step away from the gala was a step out of performance and into clarity. Behind him, that building still pulsed with murmurs, fragments of shame, whispers of realization, pockets of silence where laughter used to live. Richard fell into step beside him. "You think they'll change?" he asked, glancing back at the entrance. "Some will," Keanu replied. "Most won't, but some will pause before they mock again. That's enough." They reached the sidewalk where a few paparazzi had been waiting earlier but were now strangely absent. Not a single camera was left, not a single flash. It was as if the city itself had decided to let this moment remain undisturbed. Just two men walking quietly into the night. Richard slowed as they reached the corner. "You knew she'd fall apart." Keanu nodded, eyes forward. Truth doesn't always need a megaphone. It just needs patience. There was a silence between them that didn't need filling. The kind that exists between people who've seen behind the curtain and chosen not to tear it down, but to let others see it flutter. Back inside, the mood had shifted. Vivienne's name, once spoken in tones of admiration and fear, now hovered like smoke no one wanted to breathe in. People began to whisper apologies. Not to Keanu, he was long gone, but to each other. One man apologized to a server he'd snapped at earlier. A woman offered her wrap to another guest who looked shaken. Real kindness, not staged, emerged like plants from cracked pavement. In a quiet corner, a teenage girl who had come as a guest's daughter sat. Cross-legged on the marble floor, she tapped her phone and rewound the footage Keanu had shown. The painting, the voice clip, the way he had said nothing while the truth did all the speaking. She watched it again, then again. Finally, she looked at her reflection in the black screen and whispered, "Be like that." Not loud, just enough for herself to hear. Back outside, Richard turned to Keanu one last time before they parted ways. "Next time someone laughs at you for not playing the game." Keanu gave a small smile. "I won't even hear it." Richard chuckled, shook his head, then disappeared into a waiting car. Keanu didn't rush. He walked past the parked luxury vehicles, past the doormen still pretending not to be stunned, past a small plaque on the wall that read, "This institution was built on courage, truth, and art." He paused, just briefly, to run a finger across the word truth. It was dustier than the rest. Keanu stood alone beneath a flickering streetlight. He looked up at the sky. No fanfare, no crowd. Just the stillness that comes after something honest has been said aloud. He closed his eyes. This wasn't revenge. His voice echoed gently. It wasn't even about justice. It was about dignity. He took a slow breath. Some walk into a room to be seen. Others walk in to see what's hidden. And sometimes, when the truth is silent too long, it whispers through the wine stains. The screen faded to black. Then, softly, white letters appeared. Would you have laughed, stayed silent, or spoken up? Another line followed. Comment, I won't stay silent if you believe in dignity over appearance. And finally,
Share your favorite story of Keanu's kindness in the comments. We might feature it next. The screen remained still for a moment longer, allowing the message to breathe. Somewhere, behind thousands of screens, people paused, not to react, but to reflect. Not every story ends with applause. Some end with a mirror. And sometimes, the most incredible stories don't change the world. They change the person who needed changing most. You.